They could only control you when you didn't know who you were, when your voice still trembled under the weight of invisible expectations, when you looked into the eyes of those around you, hoping they'd mirror back some sense of identity, some echo of worth. And they could shape you, mold you into something more convenient, more palatable, more controllable. They could twist your truth until it no longer resembled you, because back then, you didn't yet know the difference between approval and love, between performance and presence, between fear and intuition. But something cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, not with fireworks or applause. It happened in silence, when you sat with the ache of your own loneliness and finally stopped running from it. It happened in the quiet hour, when you realized the world would never give you the validation you kept bleeding for. It happened when the noise outside became too loud and you decided to trust the faint whisper within. That was the awakening. Carl Jung called it the process of individuation, the long, uncomfortable, sacred journey of becoming who you truly are, not who they told you to be, not who you became to survive, but the real you, the one buried beneath layers of masks, roles, and inherited fear. And once you saw that version of yourself, once you tasted the freedom that comes from no longer needing their permission to exist, you became dangerous. Because now they can't guilt you into silence. They can't shame you into obedience. They can't reward you with scraps of affection to keep you small. You are no longer seduced by false peace. You no longer mistake comfort for safety. You no longer give yourself away in exchange for crumbs of belonging. You've seen too much, felt too deeply, lost too many versions of yourself trying to be enough. And now you carry a different kind of power. The kind that doesn't roar but resonates. The kind that doesn't chase but attracts. The kind that doesn't need to win arguments because it's rooted in truth. They don't know what to do with someone like you. Someone who no longer begs, who no longer performs, who no longer flinches when threatened with abandonment. You've stopped apologizing for your intuition. You've stopped translating your worth into someone else's language. You've stopped shrinking in rooms where your presence once made people uncomfortable. They can feel it, even if they don't understand it, even if they pretend they're not watching, even if they roll their eyes when you speak with clarity. Something in you has returned, something sacred, something unshakable. And no, this didn't happen because you wanted revenge. It happened because you finally chose truth over illusion, because you finally turned inward instead of outward, because you finally faced the mirror without flinching. That's what terrifies them. Not your anger, not your voice, not even your boundaries. What terrifies them is that you no longer need them to feel whole. You've stopped orbiting around their chaos. You've stepped out of the game, and in doing so, you've reclaimed something they thought they had broken. Your center, your clarity, your peace. The power they once held over you dissolved the moment you realized they never owned you to begin with. And from here on, they can't control you, because you belong to yourself now.
But what if the chains weren't outside you anymore? What if the weight you feel now is the ghost of a prison you've already left? You walk through the world with your shoulders tight, your chest guarded, your breath shallow, and no one sees it. No one sees how often you've had to survive. Not just events, but silence, indifference, the kind of absence that echoes louder than words. Because healing doesn't always look like light. Sometimes it looks like rage, or grief, or silence, or withdrawal. And the world will tell you that you're getting worse, that you've become too sensitive, too distant, too different. But here's what they don't tell you.
Before you can truly be free, you have to confront everything that kept you bound. And that confrontation, it's not quiet. It's not graceful. It's not Instagrammable. It's raw. It's a war between who you were taught to be and who you actually are. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's what's happening to you. Not depression, not weakness, but a calling, a pulling inward, a sacred unraveling. You are returning to your truth even if it terrifies you, even if it costs you every version of yourself that once felt safe. And yes, there's loss. You will lose things, people, habits, even dreams. But in that space, something else begins to grow. Not the person they told you to be, but the person you were always meant to become. There are moments when you look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. You wonder, who am I now? And that question, it's the beginning. It means the old story is crumbling. It means the old roles no longer fit. They won't, because the lie is too small now. You used to call it peace when no one yelled. You used to call it love when someone stayed. You used to call it strength when you didn't cry. But now you see it. You see how much of your life was survival, how much was performance, how much was silence dressed up as resilience. And in that seeing, something shifts. You no longer want to win their approval. You want to find your truth. That is not weakness. That is evolution. That is the moment your real life begins. You notice yourself pausing now before you answer, before you say yes, before you apologize for something that never needed to be forgiven. You catch yourself in the act of disappearing, and you stop, and you breathe. Because you remember, you were not born to shrink. You were born to stand, to see, to feel. You don't owe the world your silence. You don't owe your past self a performance. You don't owe your pain a home. You owe yourself the truth. And the truth is, you are not broken. You are not lost. You are not too late. You are awakening. And that is the most terrifying and holy thing you will ever do. They told you that waking up would feel like light, that it would be beautiful, effortless, liberating. But they didn't tell you that first, it would feel like death. Not death in the physical sense, but death of certainty, death of comfort, death of who you thought you were. Because when the awakening begins, it doesn't feel like revelation, it feels like unraveling. It feels like losing your grip on everything you were conditioned to believe. It feels like falling out of the life you carefully constructed, relationships that no longer fit, conversations that sound hollow, goals that once lit you up but now feel dead. It feels like standing in the ruins of a world you once called safe and realizing it was never built for you. That's why most people never awaken, not truly, because it hurts, it breaks, it shatters, it offends the ego, it challenges the narrative you've rehearsed for decades. And the truth? Most people will choose a comforting lie over a painful truth. But you didn't. You stayed, even when it made no sense, even when it scared you, even when your voice shook and your knees buckled, you kept walking through the fire. Not because you were fearless, but because something ancient inside you whispered, "Keep going, there's more." And there was, because eventually the chaos begins to quiet, the fog begins to lift, and you start to see, not with your eyes, but with something deeper. You start to remember, to reclaim, to re-inhabit the body you once disassociated from, to trust the intuition you once ignored, to love the parts of you that were shamed into silence. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, Not becoming something new, but remembering what you already are, integrating the parts that were cast into the shadow, owning the contradictions, making peace with the paradox. Because real power isn't found in pretending to be pure. It's found in embracing your wholeness. And the moment you do that, really do that, something shifts. They can't control you anymore. Not the voices that told you to stay small. Not the systems that fed off your self-doubt. Not the people who only loved the version of you that made them comfortable. They lose their grip, not because they changed, but because you did. Because once you awaken, you see the games. You hear the manipulation embedded in the praise. You feel the tension behind the smiles. You recognize the hooks disguised as love. And you no longer bite. Not out of anger, not out of rebellion, but because peace has become more valuable than performance. You don't argue to be understood. You don't shrink to be liked. You don't chase crumbs hoping they turn into connection. You know what you're worth now, and that changes everything. People notice. They call it a phase. They say you've changed. They say you've gotten cold. But the truth is, you've just stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. You've stopped explaining your soul to those committed to misunderstanding it. You've stopped begging for acceptance in rooms that thrive on your silence. You've started walking away, not with bitterness, but with clarity, with discernment, with grace. Because freedom doesn't always look like flags and noise. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like solitude. Sometimes it looks like saying no without guilt. And when you taste that kind of freedom, real freedom, not the illusion sold to you, but the kind that arises from alignment, you can never go back. You won't fit anymore. You won't tolerate what you used to justify. You won't abandon your inner voice just to avoid external discomfort. And yes, it gets lonely, because awakening separates you from the crowd, but it also brings you home, to yourself. And once you've found yourself, no one can use your emptiness against you. You are no longer governable by fear. You are no longer obedient to shame. You are no longer manipulatable by guilt. You are sovereign. You are embodied. You are awake. And they can't control you anymore.
But here's the thing they never counted on. You waking up. They were comfortable when you were half asleep, when you questioned yourself more than you questioned the system, when you kept your voice low and your needs hidden, when your pain made you obedient instead of alert. They were fine with your suffering as long as it didn't make you dangerous. But pain has a strange way of either breaking you or waking you, and this time, it woke you. You began to notice the patterns, the way the same people drained you, the way institutions groomed your silence, the way culture shaped your guilt. You stopped believing that healing meant pleasing others. You stopped giving your energy away for crumbs, and you began to reclaim what was always yours, your voice, your instincts, your power. And with that came the storm. Because awakening is never a peaceful event. It's a death disguised as clarity. It burns, it rearranges, it demolishes what was never real to begin with. You began losing the people who only liked your mask. You began feeling things you used to numb. You started grieving the decades you spent half alive. But with that grief came freedom. You started asking better questions. You stopped apologizing for your needs. You started setting boundaries, not to push people away, but to finally protect yourself. And that made you unmanageable. To those who once controlled you through shame, silence, fear, and guilt, your awakening felt like betrayal. But it was never betrayal. It was resurrection. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But you stopped avoiding. You turned inward, you faced the storm inside you and walked through it. You realized your pain was never the enemy, it was the compass. You began to see how society profits from your disconnection, how your numbness fuels consumption, how your fear creates obedience, how your wounds were never just personal, but systemic. You stopped mistaking burnout for success. You stopped calling overgiving love. You stopped normalizing self-abandonment. And because of that, you became powerful in the most dangerous way, silently, humbly, completely. They couldn't use your trauma against you anymore. They couldn't bait you into arguments. They couldn't shame you back into submission. Because you saw the whole illusion. You saw how everything was built to keep you doubting, depending, distracted. You saw how the rules were made by the same ones who needed you small. But no more. You're not bitter. You're awake. You don't need revenge. You need alignment. You don't need to fight. You need to root. You don't need approval. You need truth. And it shows in your posture, in your eyes, in your silence, in your refusal to chase what you are conditioned to crave. You walk slower now, but with more purpose. You speak softer now, but with more clarity. You love deeper now, but with better boundaries. You stopped looking for safety in others. You started cultivating it within. They tried to mold you into something obedient. You became something sacred instead. That's the part they never saw coming. And if this spoke to something inside you, if you felt the pull of your own awakening, if you've been walking through that internal fire, losing what's false and reclaiming what's real, then you're not alone. You're part of a silent revolution, one built not on noise, but on truth, on awakening, on remembering. And we're building something here, something honest, something brave. If this voice echoes your own, if this path feels familiar, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but for the moments like this, where someone somewhere finally said what you've always known. We're not just making videos, we're reclaiming ourselves together.